and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. You're watching Consider This. TRAFFIC, which is a wildlife trade monitoring network, has recently released a new report titled Southeast Asia at the Heart of Wildlife Trade. Now, this report reveals the staggering scale of wildlife trafficking here in Southeast Asia and why a renewed game plan is needed to combat it. Joining me on the show tonight, I have Kanitha Krishnasamy, Director for TRAFFIC in Southeast Asia. Welcome to the show, Kanitha.
Thanks, Melisa.
It's good to have you here. Now, I've been made to understand that this report is slightly different from all the other reports that TRAFFIC has released previously. It's because this report looks back at the last 30 years of wildlife trade. 20 years of wildlife trade. So tell me a little bit more about what this report found in its kind of cumulative study of the last 2 decades.
Okay, so basically what you said is right. We wanted to understand just the scale of wildlife trade as it involves Southeast Asia. And so we looked back at 20 years worth of data where both legal trade and illegal trade has occurred. And the legal trade sectors, we will delve into that a little bit more closely in terms of looking at how illegal trade has occurred within the legal parameters, meaning species that can be traded legally were not traded legally. They were either misdeclared or they were falsely claimed to be something else. And so we put all of this information together based on law enforcement data, based on seizures by governments, based on market availability in terms of what was openly being sold throughout Southeast Asia. And we realized that Southeast Asia really was at the center of this global trade.
Okay, well, that sounds like quite a mammoth project to have put together for this report. Has the situation gotten better or has it gotten progressively worse over the last 2 decades?
I don't think we're in any position to say that things have gotten better.
Okay.
What we're seeing is a consistent number of infractions where wildlife trade and smuggling is concerned. Governments almost on a daily basis, they're making law enforcement seizures, they're arresting individuals.
On a daily basis?
On a daily basis. I think if you look at the news being released in every single country across, not every single country, but if you look at what's happening at news on a daily basis, you will find some countries somewhere making an enforcement effort because of wildlife trade.
Okay, all right. And Southeast Asia is particularly interesting because it's this kind of weird confluence of source point, consumer of this market, also a transit point, right, because of its porous borders.
Yeah. So all countries in Southeast Asia more or less play this sort of 3 roles. We are an important source. Southeast Asia is one of the most highly biodiverse regions in the world. We've got, everything from your critically endangered tigers to your pangolins to your bears. Every single one of these animals are being targeted for trade purposes. We are also a transit region where a lot of commodities, for example, African elephant ivory or African pangolins, they are coming in to and through Southeast Asia.
To and through Southeast Asia.
Yeah, because we've got consumers in the region. We're not just source in transit, we are also a huge consumer ourselves. So we've got people wanting critically endangered plowshare tortoises from Madagascar, for example. It's a beautiful tortoise, but it's so priced, it's so rare, and in the black market, they go up to $40,000 US. So we're not talking about people like you and me who can, purchase a tortoise for $40,000 US. We're looking at a rare animal that hobbyists are seeking out, and they're going through heaps.
Okay, all right, let me just get this straight. So we talked a little bit about the region. I want to come back because this region is so interesting compared to the rest of the world, particularly for the wildlife trade. But you talked a little bit about legal trade and illegal trade. Help me understand what the legal trade enables. What is the legal trade of wildlife used for? Why is there a legal trade of wildlife?
Okay, so perhaps the easiest explanation is that trade has to happen and trade is legal. And for simple things like this chair that we're sitting on, timber, right? So wildlife includes animals and plants.
Right.
And everything from your timber products, everything from your fisheries, all of that is considered wildlife trade. And we're not saying stop all wildlife trade, we're just trying to make sure that trade, where it does happen, is being done legally and it's being done sustainably. We don't want to reach a point where you've realized, you've exploited or harvested a species so much that it's never going to recover in the wild. And so when we're talking about legal trade, that's what we're talking about. We want to make sure that it is legal. We want to make sure that it is sustainable.
Okay, and legal trade of wildlife is used for commercial purposes. So what about illegal trade? So some of these wildlife that are being trafficked or being traded illegally for medicinal purposes or presumed medicinal purposes for food, right? For trophies, and you mentioned pets for hobbyists as well? Okay.
Correct. So,
tell me a bit more.
So I suppose if you break them down to main different categories, you have them being used for food, you have them being used for traditional medicine purposes, you have them being used for live animals, for pets, and then you have the trophy and trinkets. And they comprise anything and everything from mammals to birds to reptiles and amphibians. Reptiles and amphibians, there's a huge demand to keep them as pets. Likewise with birds. I would say all countries in Southeast Asia have some level of trade, both legal and illegal, as it involves mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. Okay. Perhaps the easiest way to explain the scale of the illegal trade with mammals, for example, is African elephants and African pangolins. They're coming in the tons. So we're talking about, over almost 60 tons of pangolin scales that have come in to Southeast Asia, namely in Singapore and Vietnam, just last year. So we're not talking about a whole animal. We're talking about a pangolin scale, which is about that big. Right. But they're coming in volume of 60 tons.
So you think about how many pangolins have to be killed for scales of that volume.
Correct. And they're crossing continents. They're being moved from several countries in the African continent. They're passing through transit countries either in the Middle East or in Europe. And then they're coming into Asia and Southeast Asia. So we're talking about, at least 3 hops if you're looking at, crossing the international borders. You and I couldn't do that.
Right. That means there has had to be systemic loopholes at all 3 hops. So, to have bypassed all these transit points, right?
Exactly. So we're talking about criminal organized networks who've basically figured out the way to move large volumes of wildlife contraband across international borders. And what we're seeing, what we're seizing, is probably just a very, very, very small portion of the true scale of the smuggling.
You mentioned organized crime. So is all wildlife trafficking tied to organized crime?
Not all, but certainly the ones that are being moved in large volumes across countries, across continents, it has to be organized. Because you're talking about, first of all, if you want to move 60 tons of pangolin scales, who's getting these animals? How are you finding them? How are you consolidating them? How are you packing them? How are you putting them into a seaport or an airport and then moving them across the containers? Having somebody, depending on where it's being sent to, having somebody receive those for you and then distributing it in the marketplace.
Okay, I guess I'm wondering because, you think about organized crime and you think about human trafficking or drug trafficking. You do not normally tie organized crime to wildlife trade, illegal wildlife trade. Why is that part of organized? Is it so lucrative that it has become part of this organized syndicates MO?
Yeah, it is highly lucrative, and the financial gains are so high, and there aren't that many deterrent factors. I mean, for things like drug smuggling, many countries have the death penalty, right? For wildlife crime, the laws in most countries are weak. The penalties are not very high. For example, in countries like Laos, the fine for smuggling or trading illegally in ivory and pangolin scales goes up to $1,200 US.
Right, so that's just a pittance compared to what they can make, right?
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly.
All right, I'm going to have to interrupt here and come back, go for a quick break, come back and continue this conversation with Kanitha from TRAFFIC. Don't go anywhere, stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. I'm speaking to Kanitha Krishnasamy, Director of Traffic in Southeast Asia. Traffic, of course, is the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network, which recently released a new report titled Southeast Asia at the Heart of the Wildlife Trade. Now, I just want to compare that because what was quite interesting was you said Southeast Asia's, this kind of really, it's the consumer, it's the transit point, it's also the source. Is there anywhere around the globe that is similar to that? I mean, you talked about African elephants and pangolins a little bit before. Is there also a big demand for these wildlife, the wildlife trade in other areas of the world?
So we do see demand exists for wildlife in many parts of the world, but I think perhaps the uniqueness of Southeast Asia is that it's sort of entrenched right in the middle. Because Asia is so big and Southeast Asia is part of that, because we are such a huge source, and the infrastructure facilities in many countries in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, the port system and airport systems are very, very efficient. And it's easy for people to move around across borders, right? But the impact of Southeast Asia as a region within Southeast Asia itself, as well as within the wider world, is just so massive. North America, for example, has a huge market for live animal trade, particularly for reptiles, and a significant portion of that comes from Southeast Asian countries. So we're not talking just about demand within Asia and Southeast Asia, which is massive. That in itself is a huge problem because we're talking about a demand and supply issue, but a significant portion of Southeast Asian animals are being sought after in countries like Europe and North America, for example, with the reptile trade.
All right. Well, you also mentioned before the break that because the seizures, the scale of these seizures are so remarkable, that's already enough to to cause alarm. But you say that this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? That in fact, this is just a fraction of what's going on. How do we know that that's in fact the case?
I think it's similar to any sort of crime, right? The detection rate is where you're successful. It doesn't mean that you are detecting everything. So even if you're trying to compare it with, say, drug-related crimes or human trafficking crimes, we know that this is happening across the globe in such a huge scale. We don't have enough resources in manpower and expertise and knowledge to be able to get ahead of the game. We do what we can within our means, and so that's why we know for a fact that what we are actually seeing and detecting is just a small fraction of what's actually going on out there.
And what is the situation for Malaysia? I mean, how bad, I mean, what did the report find about the Malaysian context specifically as part of the Asian region?
So we go back to the three roles that all Southeast Asian countries play. So Malaysia is a pretty important source country for a wide array of species. Our tigers a few years ago have been categorized as critically endangered, and that's because of the poaching levels. They are so consistent. And it's not just the tigers that people are going after, poachers are going after. It's everything from our deer species, from our birds, to sun bears, to pangolins. We're seeing a huge number of both Malaysians and foreigners going into our forests, hunting these animals, and they are feeding either into a local demand or being exported outside of the country. We are also seeing a huge number of animals and animal parts coming through Malaysia. So ivory, for example, pangolin scales. In 2017, for example, customs seized about 15 tons of African pangolin scales just within a 5-month period.
So with pangolin specifically, it's medicinal for the scales, right?
Yes, it is
perceived to be medicinal. Based on some of the things that you've just said, what are some of the factors that enable Malaysia to become this source and transit point?
I don't think it's new. I think it's been in place for a really, really long time. I think people have also gotten a little bit smarter. The criminals have gotten smarter in terms of exploiting the resources and the facilities that we have. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, flying wasn't that easy. Today, you want to book a flight, you book it and you can get on the next flight in a few hours. It's that easy for people to cross both domestic and international borders. And we're not talking just about African commodities that are coming on through seaports. People are hand carrying them. We've seen cases where people have been arrested in the airports with 2 suitcases full of ivory, or 150 tortoises coming from India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. So the criminals are really using any ability, any resource, any facility out there to move contraband across nations.
So this isn't just a systemic corruption problem. This is also criminals finding loopholes or ways to best the system. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the criminals have already found where the loopholes are.
Okay.
And because we're talking about so many countries, so many different points along the transportation and logistics routes, for them, I suppose it's also a game of chance. Which routes should you use more frequently? And that also comes back to where points of law enforcement are taking place. So for example, if you're consistently moving items across 3 particular points along the trade route, and if seizures continue to happen there, they will move. It's really a cost of doing business.
Could I also ask you a little bit about wildlife cybercrime? Because when you talked about how criminals are getting smarter, there's a whole new avenue of technology now at their disposal, right?
Yes, and this is another huge headache for governments across the world, and particularly I think for Malaysia, because many countries in Southeast Asia have these open markets. So countries like Indonesia, like Thailand, like Vietnam, like Laos, you have live animal markets where ivory is sold and bought. You buy pretty much anything and everything because these marketplaces exist.
Are these markets legal?
Unfortunately, they are.
Okay.
The market itself is legal. What is being sold in the markets are not necessarily
Okay.
legal, correct? But the markets exist, right? So it's about opportunities that exist to you. Malaysia didn't have these markets. We didn't have these sort of live animal markets where you could buy and sell animals. Our marketplace right now is the online platform. You have hundreds and thousands of Malaysians that are buying and selling live animals on online platforms, and that really is a huge, huge problem for us.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break and come back, continue this conversation and look at what Malaysia can do better in terms of curbing its illegal wildlife trade. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This with me, Melisa Idris. I'm chatting tonight to Kanitha Krishnasamy, Director for Traffic in Southeast Asia. Kanitha, you've painted quite a grim picture of the wildlife trade. Rightly so, we should be concerned, we should be alarmed, and we should act, which is what the report wanted to do, the newly released traffic report. It called for a renewed game plan in combating wildlife trade, illegal wildlife trade. So, talk to me about some of the recommendations that have been put forth in this report that can be adopted by countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia.
Okay. So the recommendations that we've made are similar for most countries because no one country is unique in terms of the problems that they're facing.
Okay, so all somewhat similar.
Yeah,
okay.
they apply to pretty much all of the countries. So we're talking about governments needing to look at the legal and policy framework. Is it fit for purpose? A lot of the laws that have been in place are great when they were enacted 20 years ago, but so much has changed. The world has changed 20 years ago to where we are today.
You were just
Things
talking
like
about
online platforms.
Yes,
exactly. You know, so I think there's a serious need for governments to look at the suitability of the law in terms of tackling not just simple small level illegal trade, but organized criminality that involves wildlife smuggling across international borders.
Okay.
We also certainly want to see a lot more law enforcement taking place across Southeast Asia because we are talking fundamentally about crime. And one of the I suppose, best ways to tackle crime is to up your law enforcement. And we've seen quite a number of successes here in Malaysia. Beginning September last year, a new sort of task force was established, and this is now it's called Ops Khazanah.
Okay.
And it's quite dedicated to addressing wildlife crime.
Okay.
It's being led by the Royal Malaysian Police and the Wildlife Department of Peninsular Malaysia. that's how it started. Since then, so many other law enforcement agencies from across Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak have basically come on board and realized and recognized that this is a massive problem.
Right.
And everybody from marine police to customs to immigration to forestry agencies, everybody's realized that this is a huge problem, and they are making successes where seizures are concerned. They are making a number of arrests. They have initiated investigations into anti-money laundering.
Oh wow! I mean, it's just across the board. I mean, from what I'm understanding, things that you're saying, it just goes across every ministry, every agency, department, and almost requires the coordination of all these different I guess previously worked in silos, right?
Correct, and it's not, because it's not just a wildlife problem; it's a crime. And in some of these cases, we've seen high-powered rifles being seized, machetes, machine guns, bullets, homemade guns. It's really quite mind-boggling, and this is not somewhere far out there in some other foreign country. It's happening right here in Malaysia.
Which ministry would this fall under? Is it the Ministry of Environment for Malaysia?
So currently, with the new cabinet, this falls under the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But again, it's not just the responsibility of one ministry. Obviously, when you're talking about natural resources and wildlife, somebody has to take the lead.
Understood.
And so a particular ministry takes that lead. But because we're talking about an issue that is so serious in nature, it really requires the involvement of many agencies across Malaysia. And we've got pretty good laws. We're not just talking about the wildlife laws. The wildlife law in Peninsular Malaysia is perhaps, in our opinion, perhaps one of the most superior legislations in Southeast Asia, because the fines are really, really high. We're talking about fines that can go up to 2 million ringgit if it involves import and export of things like African ivory and African pangolin.
So you're saying that it's starting to get a little bit better. How do we ensure this momentum continues?
I think that's the million-dollar question, right? Making sure that what we've started actually remains. We're in a new Malaysia, we've got a new government, and I think from the environmental sector, we really hope that what has been initiated will continue, will remain, and we find additional resources that can assist law enforcement agencies to continue the pace that has already been initiated.
Well, what you spoke of is to curb the supply of illegal wildlife trade. What about the demand? What about, you talked about Malaysia being also not just a marketplace, but also the consumer point for these animals. What can we do in terms of persistent behavioral change for consumers?
I think perhaps this is one of the more complicated areas because changing behavior is not easy.
Right.
Telling people to do the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to do the right thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have as many people who drink and drive. It's against the law. It's not responsible. There are serious repercussions if things go wrong.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that people do it. So any effort for changing behavior is in the long term, but we have to start somewhere.
Okay.
And a number of efforts have already been initiated. TRAFFIC, for example, is engaging with the Traditional Chinese Medicine Association of Malaysia.
Okay.
This is a 4,000 strong membership across the entire country, and this is the place that buys and sells wildlife products containing derivatives of wildlife products, for example. So we are engaging with them. I don't think we're at a stage now where we can say what the impact has been. Some traders are more responsible. They have signages in shops that says they don't sell wildlife products, for example. But we're in this for the long haul, I think. We're just going to have to make sure that we have enough resources and energy to continue doing what has been initiated so far so that we can see what change happens in the very near future. Okay.
Are you encouraged by the trajectory that we're on, or is this more of a pessimistic scenario?
I'm encouraged. I think as a Malaysian, working in Malaysia and dealing with law enforcement agencies in the country, we've seen some really, really good stuff happen in the last few months.
Okay.
I think the motivation is there. again, I think it really goes back to whether or not we can sustain the level of effort that has already been initiated. And we really, really hope that that stays, because otherwise you would undo a lot of the good stuff that we've been able to do. And because we're talking about criminal operations, if the investigations don't continue, we're not going to go anywhere.
Right.
So people have to be investigated, and we're not talking just about what happens when you arrest a person, because the person who you've arrested is probably not the mastermind.
True,
so investigations have to go all the way back along the trade chain. Yeah.
Okay. All right. In the minute or so that we have left, Kanitha, I just want you to sum up your main takeaway. What would you like someone watching tonight to understand and digest and consider about the illegal wildlife trade, so that perhaps his or her opinion or has a new thought or question about this to take away tonight?
I think learning about the issues is probably the most important thing. If you know something, then you probably have a better chance of doing the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing.
Right. So get informed.
Yes, get informed.
Okay.
For consumers, please, please, please learn about the animals that you want to buy. Just because somebody's offering it doesn't mean that it's legal, doesn't mean that it's right, and doesn't mean that you should buy it.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show. That was such an
Thanks,
enlightening
Melisa.
conversation. I'm Melisa Idris. With me, Kanitha Krishnasamy, Director for Traffic in Southeast Asia. I hope you learned something about the illegal wildlife trade and take away a little bit of that awareness with you and spread that education to someone who might need that knowledge. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris. I'll catch you in another episode of Consider This. Good night.